Good evening, I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Tonight on Englebrook Independent News, we take a comprehensive look at major federal criminal cases unfolding across the northeastern United States. From large-scale fentanyl trafficking operations and firearm offenses to public corruption, fraud, child exploitation investigations, illegal re-entry cases, racketeering indictments, and terrorism-related arrests, federal prosecutors across the Northeast have remained busy throughout the month of June. We begin tonight in Maine. Federal authorities in Maine account a series of significant prosecutions this week. In Portland, Christopher Tucker of Tomsham has been sentenced to 37 months in federal prison after failing to surrender to beginning serving a series of 75-month firearm sentence. Tucker remains at large until he was located and arrested by the U.S. Marshal in Bath. Meanwhile, in Bangor, Michael Nicholas of Chelsea pled guilty to making false statements during a federal investigation involving hidden cameras discovered inside a sleeping quarters at the Togus VA Medical Center firehouse. Investigators ultimately linked Nicholas to the cameras throughout purchase records and forensic evidence. Also in Bangor, former Ellsworth resident Jenna Garnis was sentenced to more than 5 years in prison for her role in a methamphetamine trafficking conspiracy and money laundering conspiracy stretching from California to Hancock County. Federal prosecutors also announced the guilty plea of Mohammed Sultan Saleh, a citizen of the United Kingdom who admitted to illegally re-entering the United States throughout the remote Maine-Quebec border and lying to federal investigators about the circumstance. Additional Maine includes Miguel Alfonso Tapa Gonzalez, a Mexican national previously removed from the United States 3 separate times, sentenced after another unlawful re-entry. Bangor resident Scott Bagley pled guilty to bank fraud and aggravated identity theft after prosecutors have said he stole approximately $85,000 by impersonating bank customers and using fraudulent identification documents. Federal prosecutors in Vermont conclude one of the state's largest fentanyl trafficking conspiracies. 10 members of the drug trafficking organization led by Springfield, Massachusetts resident Hussein Aman had now been sentenced. Authorities say the organization distributed fentanyl and crack cocaine throughout Vermont while using social media to coordinate the sales. Investigators conducted multiple controlled purchases and uncovered firearms, large quantities of narcotics, cash, and even missing juvenile at a Vermont drug distribution property. Aman received a sentence of 10 years in federal prison. In Burlington, convicted felon Jason Douglas has been sentenced to more than 5 years in prison after allegedly pointing a loaded handgun at an individual during 2 separate daytime confrontations. Federal prosecutors noted Douglas has an extensive violent criminal history that prohibited him from illegally possessing a firearm. Federal grand juries in New Hampshire returned several serious indictments. 33-year-old Casey Murphy of Concord was indicted on federal child exploitation and child sexual abuse material distribution charges. Prosecutors allege Murphy persuaded a minor to send sexually explicit material and later distributed the child sexual abuse material to others. In a separate case, investigators say a trial of stolen cigarettes cartons led authorities directly to a suspect accused of an armed robbery in Hinsdale. Richard Corner and James Ferguson now face federal Hobbs Act conspiracy charges after authorities linked them to a robbery throughout evidence recovered in Massachusetts search warrant. Rhode Island prosecutors announced both a major healthcare fraud settlement and a sweeping gang racketeering indictment. Journey to Hope Health and Healing and its former chief executive officer agreed to pay more than $10 million to resolve allegations they billed Medicaid and Medicare for addiction treatment services that were never properly provided. The settlement stemmed from an allegation involving falsified records, inadequate counseling services, and improper billing practices. Meanwhile, federal prosecutors unsealed a massive racketeering indictment charging 26 individuals tied to Providence area street gangs. Authorities allege the criminal enterprise engaged in narcotic trafficking, firearm offenses, robbery, fraud schemes, and attempted murder and other violent crimes dating back for more than a decade. Massachusetts saw a wave of major federal cases this month as well. A Brockton woman pled guilty after allegedly attempting to deposit a stolen U.S. Treasury tax refund check worth nearly $931,000. Former Quincy Elder Service Director Thomas Calsby was sentenced after admitting to embezzling taxpayer funds to cover personal expenses ranging from a Toyota Prius and steak tips to music studio recordings and framed self-portrait. Federal authorities also announced 2 men sentenced for manufacturing counterfeit fentanyl pills, 15 arrests tied to more than $1.4 million in benefit fraud scheme involving SNAP, Social Security, house assistance, and mass health programs. The conviction of Lowell-based Dominican national after authorities seized more than 19,000 fentanyl pills, methamphetamine, cocaine, and firearms. A Springfield man received more than 6 years in prison for drug trafficking and firearm offenses. And in one of the most disturbing cases of the month, former Emmanuel College administration official Jacob Haraquez was sentenced to 12 years in prison after pleading guilty to attempting sex trafficking of a minor and cyberstalking. In Connecticut, Harry Whiteley of New Haven was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Authorities arrested Whiteley while he was allegedly carrying fentanyl, cocaine, oxycodone, a Glock pistol, and a machine gun conversion device commonly known as a Glock switch. Federal prosecutors stated the firearm was possessed in furtherance of drug trafficking activity. Several major federal cases emerged from New York. Matthew Blake Moreau Wu was sentenced to more than 13 years in prison after defrauding a Manhattan architecture firm out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Prosecutors say the fraudster later forged legal documents, impersonated officials, submitted fake medical records to federal courts, and fled prosecution before eventually being captured. Federal authorities also announced terrorism-related charges against Rita Sabatsi. Prosecutors allege Sabatsi raised approximately $600,000 throughout prompted humanitarian campaigns before funneling funds to Hamas and associated fundraising networks. Additional New York cases include a Rockland County man charged with receiving and distributing child sexual abuse material, 2 Manhattan men accused of distributing millions of doses worth of gamma balactone, commonly known as GBL, throughout New York City. In New Jersey, Homeland Security investigation announced the arrest of 5 individuals connected to cocaine trafficking and firearm trafficking conspiracies centered in Trenton. Investigators received more than 3.8 kilograms of cocaine and 16 firearms during the investigation. Federal prosecutors also charged Armando Cruz Garcia after allegedly he struck and injured an ICE agent with a van while attempting to evade arrest. In Newark, Drew Halzen was sentenced to nearly 30 years in federal prison after distributing thousands of child sexual abuse images throughout the dark web networks. Another major corruption case involves Newark area real estate developer Monsen Devancy. Federal authorities accuse Devancy of bribing city employees and participating in sales of unauthorized identification cards bearing Homeland Security insignia. Pennsylvania prosecutors announced multiple significant convictions. Justin Himbarch of Bath received more than 6 years in prison for pandemic unemployment fraud and schemes targeting local automobile dealerships. A FCI Allenwood inmate, Edward Garlock, was indicted for allegedly possessing a weapon and assaulting another inmate with a lock attached to the lanyard. Federal prosecutors also secured a guilty plea from 2 defendants connected to a racketeering operation inside the Cambria County Prison, where a nurse allegedly accepted bribes to smuggle contraband including cell phones and THC vape devices. In Pittsburgh, Theodore Brown was sentenced to 4 years in prison after participating in an identity theft scheme that fraudulently rented vehicles later used in criminal activity. We conclude tonight in Delaware. One of the largest narcotic cases in recent Delaware history ended with a sentencing of Queens resident Brahmanda Prasade. Federal investigators determined Prasade was responsible for distributing approximately 956 kilograms of cocaine along the East Coast. The investigation included wiretaps, surveillance, ship records, and drug seizure. Prasad received a sentence of 275 months in federal prison. Federal authorities also announced a $1.35 million settlement in Akram LP over allegations the company improperly obtained a Paycheck Protection Program loan by falsifying certifying its employee count. From coast to coast narcotic conspiracies and racketeering enterprises to public corruption, healthcare fraud, child exploitation investigation, and national security prosecutions, federal law enforcement agencies across the Northeast continue to pursue some of the region's most significant criminal cases during the month of June. For continued coverage of federal courts, major investigations, public safety issues throughout the Northeast, stay with Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Good night.